Most people think the economic war between the USA and China is about tariffs. Maybe semiconductors. A few angry tweets from politicians, and some headlines about trade deficits. And on the surface, that framing isn't completely wrong. But it is almost completely incomplete. Because what is actually happening between these two economies right now is not a trade dispute. It is a fundamental restructuring of the entire global economic order, and both sides know it. The tariffs are not the war, they are the opening ceremony. To understand what is really going on, you have to understand something that most coverage of this topic conveniently skips over. The USA and China are not just economic rivals. For the last 4 decades, they have been economic codependents. And that relationship, one of the most consequential in modern history, is now being deliberately, methodically, and expensively unwound. Not because one side made a mistake, but because both sides have decided, for very different reasons, that the arrangement no longer works in their favor. And when two economies that together account for nearly 45% of global GDP decide to decouple, the ripple effects do not stay between them. So what actually built this codependence in the first place? How is it being dismantled? And what does the world look like on the other side of it? Today's video is sponsored by Ground News. When covering a topic like US-China relations, almost every outlet has a point, a framing, a preferred villain. Ground News aggregates coverage from across the political spectrum and shows you exactly where each source sits on the bias scale, who owns it, and how its factuality has been rated over time. So when you see one outlet calling China's industrial policy a national security threat, and another calling US tariffs economic protectionism, you can see both framings side by side and decide what you actually think. Go to ground.news/explained to get 40% off the Vantage plan I use every day. It supports independent journalism, and frankly, it supports sanity. Now, before going further, the usual disclaimer. This is an economics channel, not a geopolitics channel, and not a foreign policy channel. There are genuinely smart people on both sides of this debate, and the goal here is not to declare a winner or pick a team. The goal is to explain the mechanics, the money, and the consequences. With that said, the numbers involved here are so large and the structural shifts so significant that it is almost impossible to discuss this topic without occasionally raising an eyebrow. So, if the odd moment of dry commentary sneaks through, consider it a feature. To understand the current rupture, you have to go back to the arrangement that created it. When China began its economic opening in the late 1970s and accelerated through the 1990s, a quiet but enormously consequential deal was struck. Not in a single room, not in a single treaty, but through thousands of corporate decisions, policy choices, and financial flows that all pointed in the same direction. The deal, broadly speaking, was this. American companies got access to an almost inexhaustible supply of cheap labor. Chinese manufacturers got access to the world's largest consumer market. American consumers got cheaper goods. The Chinese government got the foreign investment, technology transfer, and export revenue it needed to modernize at a pace that had no historical precedent. And Wall Street got fees on all of it. For roughly 3 decades, this arrangement delivered what it promised. China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, which is genuinely one of the most remarkable economic achievements in recorded history. American consumers enjoyed a standard of living that their wages alone could not have supported. Inflation stayed low, interest rates stayed low, shareholder returns stayed high. Everybody, at least everybody with access to a brokerage account, was more or less happy. But arrangements built on asymmetric dependency tend to develop fault lines, and by the mid-2010s, those fault lines were becoming very hard to ignore. From the American side, the complaints were accumulating. Chinese companies were acquiring U.S. technology, sometimes through investment, sometimes through partnership agreements. and in some well-documented cases, through less legitimate means. Whole industries, from solar panels to steel to consumer electronics, had effectively migrated to China entirely, leaving behind not just lost jobs, but lost industrial capacity. The kind of capacity that takes decades to rebuild, and that turns out to matter enormously when a global pandemic or a geopolitical crisis suddenly makes you realize you cannot manufacture your own medicine, your own chips, or your own military hardware domestically. There was also the currency question. For years, China managed its exchange rate in ways that kept its exports competitively priced, a practice that trading partners found convenient when times were good and infuriating when times were not. And then there was the market access problem. American companies operating in China faced a regulatory environment that often required them to partner with local firms, share proprietary technology, and operate under rules that their Chinese counterparts did not face when operating in the USA. It was, depending on your perspective, either smart industrial policy or institutionalized asymmetry. Probably both. From the Chinese side, the frustrations were equally real, just differently directed. The arrangement had always involved a degree of technological dependence on the West that Beijing viewed as a strategic vulnerability. Huawei's struggles in the global market, the repeated targeting of Chinese technology companies by U.S. regulators, and eventually the direct restrictions placed on the export of advanced semiconductors to China, all reinforced a conclusion that the Chinese government had been quietly drawing for years. Relying on foreign technology, foreign supply chains, and foreign financial systems was a liability, one that needed to be eliminated. And so both sides began pulling on the same thread from opposite ends. The U.S. side of this unwinding has been more visible, partly because it has been louder. It started in earnest during the first Trump administration with broad tariffs on Chinese goods, a move that was continued and in some areas deepened by the Biden administration despite the change in political rhetoric. The CHIPS Act, passed in 2022, committed over $50 billion to rebuilding domestic semiconductor manufacturing, essentially an acknowledgement that allowing that industry to offshore entirely had been a generational strategic mistake. Export controls were tightened, restricting the sale of advanced chips and chip-making equipment to Chinese firms. The investment screening process was expanded. Allies were quietly encouraged to align their own technology export policies with Washington's. And the phrase that started appearing in every policy document, every corporate earnings call, and every economic forecast was one that would have seemed absurd 10 years ago. The Chinese response has been equally deliberate, just less telegraphed. Beijing launched its Made in China 2025 plan years ago, targeting self-sufficiency in 10 strategic industries, including robotics, aerospace, electric vehicles, and advanced materials. The domestic semiconductor industry has received extraordinary levels of state support, with the explicit goal of reducing dependence on foreign chips. The Belt and Road Initiative, whatever its many complications, was in part an attempt to build alternative trade relationships and infrastructure networks that did not run through Western-aligned systems. And China has been steadily reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, a quiet but significant signal about its long-term intentions regarding the dollar's role in its reserves. What is happening, in other words, is not a trade dispute. It is two of the world's largest economies simultaneously trying to make themselves less dependent on each other. And that process, even when it goes smoothly, is extraordinarily expensive. The semiconductor situation is probably the clearest illustration of how deep this goes and how difficult it is to actually achieve decoupling in practice. Modern semiconductors are not made in one country. They are the product of a supply chain so globally integrated that it reads like a geography lesson. The designs often originate in the USA. The specialized software used to create those designs comes largely from American and British companies. The machines used to manufacture the chips are dominated by a Dutch firm called ASML, which makes equipment so advanced and so difficult to replicate that it effectively has a global monopoly on the most critical step in advanced chip production. The raw materials come from across Asia. The manufacturing itself is concentrated in Taiwan and South Korea. When the U.S. placed export controls on advanced chips and chip-making equipment going to China, it was not just restricting a product. It was trying to wall off China from an entire layer of the global technology stack. And China, for its part, has poured enormous resources into trying to climb that wall, with mixed results so far, but with a determination and a state-directed funding capacity that should not be underestimated. Meanwhile, the U.S. and its allies are trying to rebuild domestic capacity in an industry that was largely offshored over the previous 3 decades, precisely because it was cheaper to do it elsewhere. The CHIPS Act funding is significant, but building a leading-edge semiconductor fabrication plant takes years, costs tens of billions of dollars per facility, and requires a workforce with highly specialized skills that simply do not exist in sufficient numbers in the U.S. right now. This is not an insurmountable problem, but it is not a quick fix either. Beyond semiconductors, the broader economic consequences of this decoupling are already being felt in ways that extend well past the 2 countries directly involved. Supply chains that spent 30 years optimizing for cost are now being redesigned around a new variable: risk. Companies are diversifying manufacturing into Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Indonesia, a process that consultants have taken to calling friendshoring, which is a word that did not exist a decade ago and now appears in every major economic outlook. This reorientation is not cheap. It adds cost at every stage. Those costs eventually land on consumers. Trade flows are shifting. The direct trade relationship between the U.S. and China has slowed, but Chinese goods are increasingly reaching the American market through third countries, which means the decoupling is in some areas more cosmetic than structural. The 2 economies are still deeply intertwined in ways that are difficult to see from the tariff headlines, but become obvious the moment you look at raw material flows, intermediate goods, and financial markets. Trade flows are shifting. The direct trade relationship between the U.S. and China has slowed, but Chinese goods are increasingly reaching the American market through third countries, which means the decoupling is in some areas more cosmetic than structural. The 2 economies are still deeply intertwined in ways that are difficult to see from the tariff headlines, but become obvious the moment you look at raw material flows, intermediate goods, and financial markets. The dollar itself is quietly at the center of all of this. One of the less discussed dimensions of U.S. economic power is that the global financial system runs on dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. Most international trade is settled in dollars. Countries hold dollars as their primary reserve currency. This gives the U.S. an extraordinary structural advantage, sometimes called the exorbitant privilege, that allows it to run large trade and fiscal deficits without facing the currency crises that would cripple a smaller economy. China, along with several other countries that have found themselves on the wrong side of American financial sanctions, has been actively working to build alternatives. The expansion of the BRICS economic bloc, the push for bilateral trade in local currencies, and the development of China's digital yuan all point in the same direction. None of these initiatives are close to displacing the dollar's dominance, but the direction of travel is clear. So where does this end? The honest answer is that nobody knows, including the people making the decisions. The most optimistic scenario is that both sides manage a controlled separation, maintaining enough economic contact to avoid catastrophic disruption, while reducing the strategic vulnerabilities that have made both nervous. Trade continues, but in a more balanced and more transparent framework. Competition drives innovation on both sides. The global economy adjusts, expensively but survivably. The less optimistic scenario is that the decoupling proves impossible to manage cleanly, that the costs accumulate faster than the benefits, that allies are forced to choose sides in ways that fracture the multilateral systems that have, despite their many imperfections, kept global trade functioning for 80 years, that financial markets, which have for decades priced in a world of integrated supply chains and US dollar dominance, reprice in ways that are sudden and painful. The most concerning scenario is the one nobody wants to say out loud. That the economic war is not the endgame, but the precondition for something else entirely. That two great powers in a period of contested economic dominance have a historical track record that does not make for comfortable reading. What is certain is that the world is no longer operating on the assumptions that governed it for the past 4 decades. The arrangement that built modern globalization is being dismantled in real time, simultaneously, by both parties that built it. And whatever replaces it will define the economic landscape for the next generation. The tariffs were not the war, they were the opening ceremony. And we are still very much in the early rounds.